Jake stood at the kitchen counter, his hands gripping the edge as he replayed Chloe's words in his head for the fifth time that morning. "I just need some time alone," she had said, her tone light but her eyes darting away. He'd believed her, of course. After 15 years of marriage, trust came easily, or so he thought. But something about her explanation gnawed at him. Like a pebble in his shoe, he couldn't shake loose. The first clue had come on Tuesday, 2 days after Chloe's departure. A mutual friend had tagged her in a beach photo on social media. It wasn't the tag itself that caught Jake's attention. It was the setting, that beach, their beach, the one where they'd spent countless anniversaries watching sunsets and toasting to their love. His chest tightened as he stared at the photo, her radiant smile flashing on the screen. But she wasn't alone. A man stood beside her, taller and broader than him, his arm draped casually across her shoulders. "Who the hell is this?" Jake muttered under his breath, his heart pounding. He scrolled through her profile, looking for context, but the rest of her feed was carefully curated. Pictures of cocktails, ocean waves, and solo shots. No sign of the man from the photo. A cold realization washed over him. Chloe had planned this. She hadn't simply stumbled into his arms, she had orchestrated every detail of her so-called alone time. Jake's suspicion turned to certainty that evening when he noticed the missing detail she hadn't bothered to cover. Her suitcase, too neatly packed with her favorite dresses, was one. The credit card charge for a romantic getaway package at the resort was another. The final straw was a receipt he found crumpled in the trash for a spa day for two. The betrayal hit Jake like a freight train, leaving him breathless and shaking. This wasn't just infidelity. This was Chloe desecrating their most cherished memories, using the place that symbolized their love as the backdrop for her deceit. But Jake wasn't the kind of man to crumble under the weight of betrayal, not anymore. In high school, he'd learned that sometimes you had to meet adversity head on. He could still hear his late father's voice. "When someone backs you into a corner, son, don't cower. You fight." And fight he would. Over the next 2 days, Jake meticulously gathered evidence. He printed the beach photo, highlighted the receipt, and documented every transaction Chloe had hidden. Each piece was a puzzle that painted the picture he needed. He called the resort, booking a room for the following weekend. His voice remained calm, even as his blood boiled. As he packed a bag and zipped it shut, Jake took one last look at their family photo hanging on the wall. "You think you can humiliate me like this, Chloe?" he whispered. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." With that, Jake grabbed his keys, locked the door, and drove into the night. Jake arrived at the serene beach resort late Saturday afternoon, the golden light of the setting sun stretching long shadows across the sand. The sight of the resort stirred an ache in his chest. This place had been a haven for him and Chloe, a sanctuary of shared laughter, stolen kisses, and quiet evenings. But now, as he stood at the entrance, it felt like a battlefield. Jake adjusted his sunglasses, masking the storm brewing in his eyes, and strode toward the lobby with calm purpose. He checked in using an alias, avoiding any chance of alerting Chloe. The receptionist smiled warmly as she handed him the room key. "You'll love it here," she said. Jake nodded politely, his mind already racing with the steps he needed to take. The plan was simple: observe first, act later. He needed to see them together, confirm his suspicions beyond the evidence he'd gathered. A confrontation now, without the right leverage, would be reckless. He made his way to his room, a small suite on the second floor overlooking the beach. Jake set his bag down, pulled out his phone, and reviewed the screenshots he'd taken. The photo of Chloe with the mystery man, Ryan, stared back at him like a taunt. Jake's jaw clenched. Soon, he'd wipe that smug grin off Ryan's face. After freshening up, Jake headed to the resort's open-air bar. It was a hub of activity, buzzing with vacationers in colorful summer attire, sipping cocktails under twinkling string lights. Jake scanned the crowd, his pulse quickening. It didn't take long to spot them. Chloe sat at a corner table near the railing, her golden hair catching the light as she leaned in close to Ryan. They were laughing, her hand resting on his arm like it had always belonged there. Jake felt a cold knot tighten in his stomach. This was the woman he had loved, trusted, and built a life with, now acting like a stranger. He forced himself to breathe, gripping the bar counter to steady himself. This wasn't the moment to act. Not yet. Instead, Jake ordered a drink and took a seat nearby where he could observe without being noticed. He noted every detail, the way Chloe played with her hair as she spoke, the way Ryan leaned in closer, his hand brushing against hers. Jake's sharp instincts kicked in as he studied their body language. This wasn't just casual flirtation. This was a man completely comfortable in his role, and a woman who had long since abandoned her guilt. As the evening wore on, Jake noticed a pattern. Ryan seemed confident, bordering on cocky, ordering expensive bottles of wine and joking loudly with the waiter. Chloe, on the other hand, exhibited subtle tells. Glancing over her shoulder occasionally, her laughter a touch too loud, her movements slightly stiff. Beneath her polished demeanor, she was on edge. It wasn't until Ryan excused himself to take a phone call that Jake saw his chance. Chloe stayed at the table, scrolling through her phone with a small frown. Jake approached quietly, his shadow falling across her before she looked up. Her eyes widened, her face draining of color. "Jake?" she stammered, the wine glass in her hand trembling slightly. "Surprised to see me." Jake's voice was steady, almost calm, but his eyes burned with intensity. "Thought you needed time alone." Chloe opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Jake leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a cold whisper. "Relax. I'm just here to enjoy the resort. You know, like you and your friend." Before she could respond, Ryan returned, his carefree smile faltering when he saw Jake. "Who's this?" he asked, his tone laced with annoyance. Jake straightened, extending his hand. "Jake! Chloe's husband." He watched with satisfaction as Ryan's confident facade crumbled, his hand hesitating before reluctantly meeting Jake's. The moment was electric, charged with unspoken tension. "Well, don't let me interrupt your fun," Jake said, stepping back with a smirk. "I'm sure we'll have plenty of time to catch up later." He turned and walked away, leaving Chloe and Ryan frozen, their perfect evening now hanging by a thread. Back in his room, Jake closed the door and exhaled deeply. The confrontation had been brief, but it was enough to rattle them. Now he had the upper hand. Tomorrow would be the day he unraveled their lies completely. The morning sun filtered through the gauzy curtains of Jake's suite, casting an ethereal glow across the room. He sat on the balcony, a mug of black coffee in hand, staring out at the pristine shoreline. The rhythmic crash of waves did little to calm the turbulence within him. Today was the day everything Chloe thought she could hide would come crashing down. He had spent the night preparing, meticulously piecing together the steps of his plan. Jake's laptop lay open on the table beside him, displaying the evidence he'd gathered. Receipts, screenshots, the damning beach photo. A flash drive containing everything was safely tucked into the pocket of his jeans. Now it was just a matter of timing. The resort's weekly beach brunch, with its open seating and lively crowd, provided the perfect backdrop for what was to come. As noon approached, Jake dressed deliberately, choosing a crisp, button-down shirt and khaki shorts, clothes that spoke of calm and confidence. He checked his reflection in the mirror, noting the resolve in his eyes. Whatever happened next, he was ready. Downstairs, the brunch area buzzed with activity. Vacationers filled the tables, their laughter and chatter mingling with the gentle hum of live acoustic music. Jake spotted Chloe and Ryan almost immediately. They were seated near the center, a prime location, sipping mimosas and sharing a plate of tropical fruit. Chloe looked radiant, her laughter forced but present, while Ryan lounged with the ease of a man who believed he owned the world. Jake approached unnoticed, weaving through the tables until he stood just a few feet away. His shadow fell over them, and Chloe froze mid-laugh. Her eyes met Jake's, and he saw the panic ripple across her face. "Mind if I join you?" Jake asked, his tone neutral but charged. Without waiting for a response, he pulled out a chair and sat down, setting his phone and the flash drive on the table. Ryan's confident smirk faded into a scowl. "What the hell are you doing here?" he demanded. Jake turned to him, his expression calm, enjoying brunch, same as you. "Jake, please," Chloe began, her voice barely above a whisper, but he silenced her with a sharp look. "Don't worry, Chloe, I'm not here to cause a scene," he paused, letting his words hang in the air. At least, not yet. The tension at the table was palpable. Ryan shifted uncomfortably, his bravado faltering under Jake's steady gaze. Chloe, on the other hand, looked as though she might crumble at any moment. Jake leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "I couldn't help but notice this is a special place for you two. Funny, isn't it? How a resort that holds so many memories for me and my wife would become the setting for this." He gestured vaguely at the two of them, his meaning unmistakable. Ryan opened his mouth to respond, but Jake cut him off. "Save it. I'm not interested in your excuses. I'm here to talk about the facts." From his pocket, Jake retrieved a small stack of printed documents and photos. He spread them across the table like cards in a high-stakes poker game. The receipts for Chloe's trip, the photo of her with Ryan, the highlighted charges to their joint account. Each piece of evidence was another nail in the coffin. Chloe's face turned ashen. "Jake, I can explain. Explain? Jake's voice was calm, but the steel behind it was unmistakable. Explain how you lied to my face about needing time alone? Or how you used our money to fund your little getaway with him? He jabbed a finger toward Ryan, who had gone pale. Ryan finally spoke, his voice low and defensive. Look, man, I didn't know she was married at first, she said. Jake held up a hand, silencing him. Save your lies. I'm not here to hear you grovel. I'm here to set the record straight. He turned his attention back to Chloe. Did you really think I wouldn't find out? That you could lie to me, steal from me, and I'd just, what, roll over and let you get away with it? Chloe's lip quivered, tears welling in her eyes. Jake, I'm sorry. I made a mistake. A mistake? Jake leaned forward, his voice low and lethal. A mistake is forgetting to buy milk. This was calculated. You didn't just stumble into his arms. Chloe, you planned this. You chose this. The surrounding tables had gone quiet, the brunch crowd now watching the drama unfold like a live soap opera. Jake didn't care. Let them see. Let them witness the truth. He stood, gathering the evidence and tucking it back into his pocket. I've already filed for divorce, he said, his voice loud enough for the onlookers to hear. Our accounts are frozen, and I've protected my assets. You won't see another dime of my money. Chloe's tears spilled over, her composure finally cracking. Ryan, meanwhile, looked ready to bolt but stayed rooted to his chair, likely out of fear of drawing more attention to himself. Jake turned to leave but paused, glancing back at them one last time. Enjoy the rest of your vacation, he said, his voice dripping with finality. It's on you now. As he walked away, the weight on his chest lifted slightly. There was still pain, still anger, but there was also freedom. Jake knew this wasn't the end of his journey, but it was a start, a clean break from the lies and betrayal. Jake drove back from the resort with the windows down, the salty breeze mingling with the scent of pine trees as he wound through coastal roads. The confrontation had been cathartic, but it left a hollow ache in its wake. He had won, yes, but at what cost? The woman he had trusted with his life had betrayed him, and no amount of righteous indignation could fully numb the pain. The drive gave him time to think. The fallout from his actions at the resort would ripple through his life and Chloe's in the coming days. He had dropped the bombshell, but the dust was far from settled. Jake reminded himself of his father's advice. When you burn bridges, make sure you've built a better one to cross. By the time he reached his home, Jake's determination had crystallized. The first step was ensuring he could move forward, free of entanglements with Chloe. Inside the house, he set his laptop on the dining table, logged into his bank accounts, and began the tedious process of reviewing every shared asset they owned. From the vacation home to the joint investments, Jake meticulously documented everything. He wouldn't let Chloe walk away with more than her share, not after what she had done. As he worked, his phone buzzed incessantly, missed calls from Chloe, unread messages piling up in his inbox. At first, he ignored them, focusing instead on the task at hand. But curiosity got the better of him, and he opened one of her texts. Jake, please, can we talk? I'm sorry for everything. I need to explain. He scoffed, tossing the phone onto the table. Chloe's pleas were as hollow as her promises had been. She wasn't sorry for what she'd done. She was sorry she'd been caught. Still, a small voice in the back of his mind nagged at him. Was he handling this the right way? Could he have done things differently? Jake shook his head, shoving the thought aside. This wasn't about reconciliation. It was about protecting himself from further harm. The next day, Jake met with his lawyer, Rachel, a no-nonsense woman with a sharp mind and a reputation for being ruthless in the courtroom. As he laid out the details of Chloe's betrayal, Rachel took notes with a calm efficiency that bolstered Jake's confidence. We'll ensure the divorce is swift and fair, she said, glancing up from her notepad. From what you've shown me, Chloe doesn't have much ground to stand on. But be prepared. People like her often lash out when cornered. Jake nodded, steeling himself for the possibility of Chloe fighting back. He had prepared for this moment, but Rachel's words served as a stark reminder that the battle wasn't over. Over the following days, the fallout from the confrontation at the resort began to unfold in earnest. Chloe made several attempts to contact Jake. Calls, emails, even a handwritten letter left in the mailbox. Jake read it once, his jaw tightening as he skimmed the familiar refrains of apology and regret. I didn't mean to hurt you, she wrote. I was confused, lost, and Ryan was just there. But Jake knew better. Confusion didn't lead someone to lie, manipulate, and steal. Chloe had made her choices, and now she had to live with the consequences. The resort incident also reached the ears of mutual friends and family. Jake was careful about how much he shared, choosing to focus on the facts rather than indulging in the emotional mess. Chloe and I are divorcing, he told him. She made choices I can't forgive, and I'm moving forward. Most of their friends were supportive, offering condolences and even a few hushed admissions that they'd noticed something off about Chloe in recent months. She seemed distant, one friend confessed. I didn't want to say anything, but now it makes sense. Jake appreciated their support, but he didn't linger on the sympathy. He had no interest in playing the role of the victim. Instead, he poured his energy into rebuilding his life. He started going to the gym more often, finding solace in the rhythmic clang of weights and the burn of exertion. He reconnected with old hobbies, woodworking, hiking, and photography, things he'd set aside during the marriage. It wasn't long before Jake found himself feeling lighter, freer. The betrayal still hurt, but each day the sting lessened just a little. He even began to imagine a future beyond the wreckage Chloe had left behind, a future where he could find peace and maybe even love again. One evening, as Jake sorted through old photos, he stumbled upon a picture from their first trip to the beach resort. Chloe's face beamed with genuine joy, her arm looped around his. For a moment, his resolve wavered. Had it all been a lie, or had there been a time when their love was real? He couldn't say for sure. What he did know was this: he couldn't change the past, but he could shape his future. Jake slipped the photo back into the box, closed the lid, and stood. The man he was now, the man who had stood up for himself, exposed the lies, and refused to settle for less, deserved better. And for the first time in a long while, Jake was ready to claim it. It was a crisp autumn morning when Jake finally stood outside his lawyer's office, a stack of finalized divorce papers in his hand. He flipped through them briefly, noting Chloe's signature scrawled on the last page. The legal process had been quicker than expected, clean, efficient, just like Rachel had promised. There was no dramatic courtroom showdown, no fiery back and forth. Chloe had tried to push for a larger share of their assets at first, but Jake's airtight documentation of her actions made it clear she had no leverage. In the end, she had agreed to the settlement, likely out of fear that a protracted fight would only add to her humiliation. Jake exhaled deeply as he stepped into the sunlight. The papers represented the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. The weight that had pressed on his chest for weeks now felt lighter, as though he could finally take a full breath. He drove home in silence, his thoughts drifting to what lay ahead. He had spent so much time focused on exposing Chloe's betrayal and securing his own position that he hadn't truly considered what life would look like without her. The idea was daunting, but it also carried a strange sense of exhilaration. For the first time in years, Jake had the freedom to shape his life without compromise. The first step, he decided, was reclaiming his space. He spent the following days clearing out every trace of Chloe from the house. Her clothes, her jewelry, even the coffee mug she used every morning. He packed it all into boxes and dropped them off at her sister's house. The process was cathartic, like peeling away the remnants of a wound that was finally starting to heal. With the house to himself, Jake began transforming it into a place that reflected his new reality. He painted the walls in bold, vibrant colors that Chloe would have hated, replaced their shared furniture with pieces he'd picked out alone, and hung framed photographs from his travels on the walls. His favorite was a black and white shot he'd taken years ago of the beach at sunrise, a reminder that even endings could hold beauty. Jake also threw himself into his work, finding solace in the structure and purpose it provided. As a contractor, he'd always loved the process of building something from the ground up, and now his projects felt like metaphors for his own life. He took on more clients, poured himself into every detail, and watched as his reputation for precision and creativity grew. For the first time in years, Jake felt like he was in control, not just of his work, but of his destiny. It wasn't long before his personal life began to open up as well. Friends who had heard about the divorce invited him out more often, encouraging him to join them for dinners, hiking trips, and weekend getaways. Though hesitant at first, Jake found himself enjoying the company. He realized he'd spent too long isolating himself during his marriage, putting Chloe's needs above his own. Now, he was rediscovering the value of community and connection. One evening, during a casual get-together, Jake met Lauren. She was a photographer with a quick wit and a warm smile, and their conversation flowed effortlessly. Lauren was different from Chloe in every way, grounded, genuine, and unpretentious. They exchanged numbers that night, and over the weeks that followed, Their connection deepened. Lauren wasn't a whirlwind romance or a grand gesture. She was a steady presence, a partner who made Jake laugh and challenged him to see the world differently. They spent hours hiking trails, sharing stories over cups of coffee, and exploring the kind of quiet joy that Jake hadn't realized he'd been missing. On a chilly November morning, Jake and Lauren stood on the same beach where he had confronted Chloe weeks before. The resort was visible in the distance, its cheerful facade a stark contrast to the turmoil Jake had felt during his last visit. But this time, there was no bitterness, no anger, only a sense of peace. Jake turned to Lauren, who was adjusting her camera to capture the sunrise. "It's funny," he said, his voice thoughtful. "This place used to mean something completely different to me." Lauren looked up, her expression curious. "And now?" Jake smiled, the corners of his eyes crinkling. "Now it's just another beach. A beautiful one, sure, but nothing more." He paused, glancing at her. "The meaning we give things, it's all about perspective, isn't it?" Lauren grinned, snapping a photo. "Exactly." As the sun broke over the horizon, casting the world in hues of gold and amber, Jake felt a sense of closure he hadn't thought possible. The betrayal, the pain, the anger, they were all part of his story, but they no longer defined him. He had built a new life, one that felt honest and full of possibility. And for the first time in a long while, Jake was truly content. His past was behind him, and his future stretched out ahead, a blank canvas waiting to be filled.